It's a great pleasure to talk to Allan Brigham. Alan, where and when were you born?
I was born in Harpenden, which is near Luton in Hertfordshire.
Right. In what year?
1951.
1951. And is there anything significant you'd like to say about your early years? What's your first memory, for example, if you can recall it?
We moved when I was 5. So I know that anything I can remember before we moved, I was under 5. And most of my memories are of my grandmother. I was talking to a friend yesterday, actually, who said that she never knew her grandparents. And it just made me realise how lucky I was to know my grandparents. Every Saturday, my parents would go shopping and do the cleaning, and me and my brother would be left with my grandmother. And my grandmother played with us and indulged us and read us stories. My earliest memory is every Saturday we'd go and make a house for the cat in the garden. The cat was called Toodles, and my grandmother was therefore called Toodles Granny, which I never thought twice about. You know, she was Toodles Granny, and Toodles was meant to sleep in the house in the garden. It wasn't until I was 30 and my grandmother was in her 80s, and I was tape recording her just like this, just really as a way I'd go to see her and as an excuse to go and see her. And we were talking about my childhood, and she said, "Do you remember we used to make those houses for the cat every Saturday, and you thought that the cat slept in them?" And she chuckled and she said, "Of course the cat never slept in the garden." And even at the age of 30, I was disappointed that she'd fibbed to me. It's a bit like Father Christmas, isn't it? So it was a fib, but it was a wonderful way of it was a wonderful way to spend a Saturday, building and rebuilding this house for the cat to sleep in. But I don't remember my parents. That's the real thing. I don't actually remember my parents until we moved. So the moral of that is that grandparents indulge and play with you. My mother, who must have had to change my clothes, do my washing, is almost a blank.
What were your parents doing? I mean,
my mum was a physiotherapist, and my father he worked for an insurance company.
Right, and then where did you move?
Well, we moved to Surrey. They told me it was going to be my father's work moved, and I always remember them telling me that it was going to be very hot because we were nearer France. Of course it wasn't, but I believed it was because they told me.
Was it a nice house?
It was a nice house. It was a middle-class upbringing, and really that's where we lived until I went to university. I went to university in Sheffield. I remember I wanted to go to university in Sheffield because I wanted to study history and politics. History was the subject I enjoyed, but I was curious about politics. And the professor of politics at Sheffield was a man called Bernard Crick, and I'd read his name. I'd seen his articles in the papers, and I wanted to go there. But I always remember our neighbour looking at me very sadly down in Surrey that I was going to the north to university, and there must be something really wrong with me to have to go to somewhere so far away. But it was actually one of the best. I think going there going north was one of the best things I ever did. Living in a northern city broadened my mind as much as the course that I did, meeting people. I always remember meeting my first Geordies in the student bar, and I couldn't understand what they were saying. And I thought Sheffield was nearly in Scotland, which is another place I'd never been to, and they thought Sheffield was nearly in London. And it gave me a sense, I think, for the first time, of just how big and different the country is. And if I'd stayed in the south of England all my life, I'd have missed that. I'd have probably gone to the north just to go to the countryside, maybe you go to the Lake District, but I'd never have actually been to a city, be surrounded by my fellow students who were mostly trained to be engineers. It was a completely different environment. And the really strange thing was actually my brother then went to Sheffield, and he discovered that my grandmother had been born in the street next to where we were living. And you suddenly realise that within a generation the family can forget where it's come from. So, and in fact and even though my grandmother had probably told me, and I'd heard it, it doesn't sink in, because my grandmother as a child in Harpenden had lived just round the corner. And so really in my mind that's where she'd always lived, but she'd got a past too, and she'd made Harpenden her home, it wasn't where she was born. And my dad had been teased at school because of his accent. They'd moved when he was young, and so my grandmother, when I interviewed my grandmother, then it also turned out, she said that she'd had to change her accent so that my dad didn't get bullied at school. And I later went to work in Bradford, and then I discovered my grandmother's parents had retired to Bradford, and her sister had lived and died there. And you suddenly discover these links which you've been told about, but which actually you just don't listen to until maybe you go to a place.
Because now you mention it, Brigham is probably a northern name, isn't it?
Well, there's a village called Brigham near Pocklington, but I've yet to trace my family history, but I have looked at the censuses, and there are Brighams clustered around Pocklington. And in fact, my niece has been at university in Birmingham, and I went to see her last term, and I did go through the 19th century censuses for Birmingham, because my family moved from, so I did trace, they moved from near Pocklington with the railways to Birmingham in the mid-19th century. And I traced the houses from the 1851 census through to 1911. We went round looking at where they'd lived, and they were very devout. The history of my family is Methodism. They were Methodist lay preachers. My grandmother's side of the family, they were Methodist ministers. And one of the ironies is that one of the demolished sites of one of the houses my families had lived in Birmingham is now a mosque. And they can never have thought, can they? They believed Methodism was the future, and they can never have believed that their house had been blitzed to build a mosque, which is just a completely alien culture. So it just makes you think about the changes that have happened in this country, and I suppose specifically to our family as well.
You mentioned Methodism. I mean, has that influenced you? Are you religious, or did you go through the teenage religious period and confirmation and things like that, so on?
Well, my wife's Catholic, and Catholicism and Methodism are very different. She was brought up a Catholic, but it's actually, I find it's something we share in common, that we're probably the last generation that went to church every Sunday. And both of us rejected it. My parents wanted me to get confirmed, and I had to fight. I was the eldest in my family. And the church mattered to my parents. My grandmother's 3 brothers had all been Methodist ministers. Her father was a Methodist minister. His father was a Methodist minister. Her uncle was a Methodist minister. My father's family were lay preachers. My mum was involved with the church where we lived, and my dad, did the accounts for the church. It was very much part of their life. And so I was disappointed them. I had a teenage fight. I've got younger brothers who are 10 years younger than me, and they just didn't have to have that. They just stopped going to church. So it's one of the things about being the oldest, I suppose. By the time they came to be teenagers in the 1970s, other people weren't going to church, and my parents accepted it.
Have you ever come back? I mean, what's your present religious?
I've never come back, and I sometimes wish that I had belief. But I haven't. It's not there. I always remember there's a film or a play called The Ruling Class, and I don't know if you've seen it. The version I saw was a film, and it had Peter O'Toole in it, and Peter O'Toole is Lord of the Manor, and he invites all his neighbours to a ball, And they come to this big house, and it's lavishly decorated, and everybody's milling around in the hall drinking glasses and being entertained, but they can't find their host. And everybody's saying, "Where's our host? Where's our host?" And suddenly he says, "I'm here." And they all look up, and he's on a crucifix on the wall. And he says, "What are you doing there?" And he says, "I'm God." And somebody says, "How do you know?" And he says, "Well, every time I pray, I find I'm talking to myself." And I've always liked that quote. That was my problem when I prayed. I never felt I was praying to anybody else. I wish I had been. And then I think isn't it amazing that we live in a country where people are respected and in esteem because they believe in God? I mean, it's science fiction. I find that amazing if you look at it rationally. That people who believe that in a being that created the world, that there's a heaven, if we didn't know about it and we were told about it, we would think it was completely extraordinary, and yet it's part of our culture. But Methodism, I didn't go to church, but I never know if you pick up the values from the church or not, if you just pick them up from the people around you. And I never know if the fact that actually I think I'm slightly dyslexic, and I never knew what I ended up doing as a living evolved, but actually what I'm good at, it's called public engagement these days, I think. But what I'm quite good at is as a tour guide, or as in my work, I used to go into schools talking to kids. I'm quite good at communicating. And I never know if that's a relic of my Methodist minister genes. Maybe that's what they were good at.
A lay preacher you are, Alan, in a new sense. Did you come across Bernard Crick, at university?
He was my tutor.
He's a famous...
Called me a nit, I always remember. I shared tutorials with David Blunkett.
Did you? Good heavens.
David Blunkett was a mature student. I mean, David Blunkett wouldn't know me, but he used to sit at the front of the classes because he had a dog, and people used for 1 year we had tutorials in those days. There'd be about 5 people in a tutorial. I suspect they don't have those any longer. I mean, I'm to be truthful, I'm not that bright, and Bernard Crick, as an 18-year-old, politics was a subject that I thought I wanted to study, but which actually, and I found really stimulating. But Bernard Crick was like many steps ahead of me quite often. I didn't grasp what he was talking about. But what's always stuck with me, I don't know if you read anything by Bernard Crick. I
have read articles, I'm sure.
I can always remember him. He was Scottish. He had an accent. He had a huge stammer. And I remember the lectures, and I can still hear him trying to say the polis, the Greek polis. He couldn't get it out. And 40 years later, I can hear it juddering through my head. And Bernard Crick was really into citizenship.
Yeah.
And I went to study politics because I was interested in governments and why they fall and why they rise, but really more from a historical point of view. And the crucial thing that Bernard Crick taught me was about the art of politics itself. I mean, his book at the time was quite well known. It's called In Defense of Politics. And he really taught me the importance of politics as a process. Politics can hold together a society. It's a way of dealing with different opinions. I suppose ultimately it's that thing about the House of Commons, isn't it? The width between the opposition and the government, or the width of a sword. It's better that they have 10 hours of Prime Minister's Cheston time shouting at each other than that they kill each other. And it takes quite a long time to evolve a system where that is accepted. So Bernard Crick was a great advocate of politics as a process, and that's always stuck with me. And I've got a huge respect for politicians. I think it's a real shame that now it seems to be everybody seems really happy to criticise the politician. I mean, I did a tour last week, and in local government I was talking about the suffrage, It wasn't until 1928 that women finally got the vote, and unless they owned property. So in their own right, they didn't have the right to the vote until
Well, it was changed then to everyone over the age of 18. Before 21-year-olds,
right?
Women about 1921.
But it wasn't that long ago, is the point.
Very, very recent.
And people fought for this, and yet now in local elections, 2/3 of the population don't vote. It's like they just sit in front of their television sets blaming somebody else, and I just think we're amazing. You were talking about China, and I would say it's amazing we live in a country where if I really think the system's bad enough, I can put myself forward for election, see if I can convince people to vote for me, and I could be in the town hall seeing if I could do better. I think that's an amazing process, which I think we're incredibly lucky to have, because most of the world doesn't. And I think that's what I learned from Bernard Crick.
What was Blunkett like? Was he clever?
David Blunkett was clever. He was quite he was like deliberate, thoughtful. I never really spoke to him personally. I spoke with him in tutorials. Yes, and I wouldn't really want to make any other judgment on him, really. It was interesting, years later,
see him.
He emerged as a minister. And actually, yes, because it was under David Blunkett, when he was education minister, that citizenship was put on the national curriculum, and Bernard Crick was the lead on it. And it did make me aware of, there's a word for it, isn't it? Diffusion of ideas. That in the past, it must have been very much, it was the people who were being educated at Cambridge that 30 years later, when they got to the pinnacles of their career, the ideas of their professors or their teachers at Oxford or Cambridge may well be realised through people who have achieved power one way or another. I suppose that was another change in the 20th century, wasn't it? That actually for the provincial university, it's an illustration of somebody from a provincial university picking up an idea, the idea that politics was important as a student, and 30 years later actually making it real through the national curriculum.
Very interesting. You did history as well.
Yeah.
Did you enjoy that or not?
Yes, but it was very it was kings and queens. It was chronological. I'm glad I did it. It was a chronological history from the Saxons, English history from the Saxons to now. But it wasn't really social history. I did a bit of American history, and I was always more interested in how do people live. And somewhere I got interested in local history. It was a time, late 60s, early 70s, I suppose, when people were starting to do social history. I wasn't involved in it, but I was aware that in Sheffield there were WEA adult education classes where you go out collecting memories and doing things like that, a different approach to it. But I was curious, how do people live? How do they eat? What do they eat? How do they earn a living? And the sort of history I did at university didn't tell you any of that.
Were you a fan of Tawney, R.H. Tawney?
At the time I wasn't. I mean, I've glanced at Tawney since, but I'm trying to think.
Hoskins hadn't reached you?
No. Well, Hoskins must have reached me. When I was at university. Because Hoskins did a course at Leicester, an M.A,
that's right,
which I would have loved to have done. And I suppose for a long time afterwards, I always thought that if I ever had the time or the ability, it'd be nice to do a local history M.A at Leicester. And when I came to Cambridge, I was really surprised. I thought the evening education classes in local history, and I think one of the things that disappointed me was that I couldn't find anything. There were classes on the history of the university, but there was nothing on the history of the town. and I was working and I didn't have time. But then I remember one year looking at the adult education classes, and there was one on industrial archaeology, and I thought that couldn't have anything to do with Cambridge. I thought it would be the history of Manchester and Birmingham. But I went along, and the tutor was brilliant. He was he had worked for Cambridge Instruments. He was interested in technology, but he also understood the social implications of it. And we talked about industrial archaeology in East Anglia, in Cambridge, and then one evening he said, come out of the school. It was Parkside. We walked out of Parkside, and we went and we walked round, and we went to New Square, and it's surrounded by little stubby iron posts, which are just a trip hazard. But in the dark, he looked at one of these and he said, these were made in Cambridge. And then he looked at the base of them, and there's a little eagle. And these were made in Cambridge. And then we went to Maid's Causeway, and there are more cast iron railings. I don't know if you've noticed them on the raised causeway. And these ones have they're taller, and they have a tulip head to them. And then we went across the road to Midsummer Common, and there are more cast iron railings surrounding the railings. And those are different again. They have what I call they have a different type of head again, typical Cambridge post. And you put your hand on them if you live in Cambridge, you'll have passed by them, but you probably don't notice them. But again, he said these are made in Cambridge. And we had a project for a year of discovering where the Cambridge foundries were. We walked around identifying where they were they were. People thought we were mad. It was a good bonding exercise. It was a really good example of adult education. A completely diverse group of people from different backgrounds, bonded by this search for cast iron railings. I interviewed the man who'd cut them all down in the Second World War. And for that, and the ones in front of this college as well, King's College. And of course they were useless. They were meant to be cut down to make equipment for the war, but it was the wrong sort of metal, so they were just taken somewhere and melted down, and it was scrap. So it's called the psychological effort to the war now. But he was exempted from war service for doing that. And I suppose through that, ironically, it was a course that I never thought I'd get interested. I got more interested in the local history of Cambridge, not just the colleges. And one of the things I suppose I learnt from Chris, the tutor,
what was his name?
Chris Hall. His theme would be, he was born and bred in Cambridge, he worked for Cambridge Instrument Company. His theme very strongly was that the high-tech industries in Cambridge, which were just really starting then, owed as much to the research of the university as they did to the technical skills of the townspeople. And his point was always that the technical skill, the Nobel Prize winners get written up in literature, but the technical skills of the townspeople who actually made the instruments, they get forgotten. Or without them, it was a fusion of skills from two different sources, really. I think that was his thing, and I suppose I'd stick with that. That places like, the Pies and Cambridge Instruments, and the places that have sort of, gave Cambridge prosperity in the 30s and 30s through to the 60s, had that combination of town skills and academic skills, and that was the basis of the sort of high-tech firms we've got here in a way now.
Interesting. So let's go back. You finished your degree. Did you come straight to Cambridge after?
I worked in Bradford for a while.
For how long?
I did two jobs. First of all, I went back to Surrey. I worked in a corn mill, or a cattle mill. And actually that's where I really got more sucked into local history, because there was an old maltings attached to. We made cattle fodder. I used to bag up chicken feed and hump sacks around. But there was an old maltings where we used to store stuff, and I'd go down there, and the old boy I worked with, Ted Mansfield, he was 75, and he'd worked for this firm all his life, and his pension, I always remember this, his pension was the ability to, the right to carry on working as long as he could. They'd pay him. You didn't get a pension, but you just carry on working for the firm. That's an old-fashioned an old-fashioned way of doing it. I suppose I was at the end of that period. And at any rate, in the middle of this malting was all these business documents for this firm dating back to the 1780s. And it was a combination of their sales of corn to local farmers, what they were buying, but also the family records. So there was documents about building a house, how many bricks went into building the owner's house, where they sent their children to school, where they bought their newspapers from, just stashed and mouldering in the middle of this old maltings. And I love this, because I couldn't look at it during work time, but I got permission from the owner to go down there on Sundays, and only with him though, because he was really conscious. The family were also involved in the local, running the vestry, the local parish, and there were 19th century rate books there, and there were some of the names of those who were getting poor relief in the 19th century were still Beresfords. They were one of the families who still lived in Dorking, who were still poor, and he was a paternalistic, old-fashioned conservative, and he was very worried that the 20th century Beresfords would be humiliated by it going into the public domain that their family had been getting poor relief in the 19th century. So he was very controlling about what we did with these documents. We sorted them out, and it was just fascinating going through those. And eventually these documents ended up in the Surrey Record Office. And the family was interesting because they were millers in Surrey. They'd owned 2 or 3 mills. They'd risen through the middle classes in the 19th century, and then in the late 19th century, one branch stayed in Dorking, running the mills. But there was education. One became a clergyman, one became a lawyer, and the one who became a lawyer moved to London, and obviously, he became a professional, moved into different social strata. The ones who remained in Dorking remained very conservative with a small c, but the one in London, his son, because the firm was called Attlee, so his son was Clement Attlee, who became Prime Minister for the Labour Party. And I always remember I interviewed the last Attlee in Dorking, an old lady, and we talked about the firm and the business and everything else. And I asked her about Clement Attlee, and I was naive then. I was, young, and I thought she'd say something about the National Health Service or something about the post-war Labour government, and she didn't mention any of it. She scratched her head, and she said there was that boys' club in Stepney, and that's really the only good thing she had to say about Clement Attlee. So I guess I learned something about people. So I did that, and then I went up to Bradford and worked in Bradford for a housing aid society as part of shelter. And then I didn't have anywhere to live in Bradford. I lost, if you live in Bedsits, the landlord constantly changes the lease, they put the rent up. I went off to Greece. I thought I'll go to Greece. I went to Greece for a couple of months, came back. There was a letter from an old friend who was living in Cambridge who said, just by the way, there's a spare room here. And I thought, I'll come to Cambridge and save some money. I thought I was going to train as a teacher. And I came to Cambridge in, I don't know what, the mid-1970s, with no intention of staying here. It was flat. I'd lived in Yorkshire for 5 years effectively before I came here, and I was just used to hills. I used to go walking in the Peak District or in the Pennines every weekend. That was a ritual. We'd go walking every weekend if we could. I'd been brought up in Surrey, which was hilly, and I could not understand how anybody could live in this bit of the world. And there's there's so much open space in the north. I think the north is if you live in the south, you have a warped attitude towards the north of England. It's industrial cities or bogs. There's so much space there, and you think, well, I remember thinking, why don't people move there? Why do they stay here? And Cambridge it's this stone and this white grey brick. It's not colourful. And I thought the city was full of rather arrogant young students, and I was in my mid-20s and beyond that, and And I was not impressed with the old buildings either, because I suppose they were the old buildings of stately homes, and in those days I was a bit dismissive of that. So I didn't intend to stay. I thought I'd get some money. I saw a kid yesterday and he said, I don't know what I'm going to do. My job's just finished. I'm going to go and work in Tanzania for a month. And then I don't know what I'm going to do afterwards. And I just remember saying, it's scary, but it's the most exciting time of your life, and almost part of me would love to go back there now. But I didn't know what was going to happen. And the only job I could get, couldn't get a job anywhere. Everywhere I went, I was either overqualified because I got a degree and my work record wasn't good enough, I couldn't get a job using my degree, and I didn't want to go on the dole. I remember walking around Cambridge, going for interviews all over the place, and walking home one day, and I was living in Newnham in Elterslie Avenue, and it was about this time of year, autumn, and there was some road sweepers at the bottom of the road with a huge pile of leaves, and I just stopped and said, I like it here, but I've got somewhere to live, but I can't find a job. And they looked at me as though I was mad and said, you can't have tried the council. And I said, where's the council? I only knew my way from Newnham into the town centre then. I didn't know where Mill Road was, but they said, you go down Mill Road, you find the railway bridge, you go behind there. And I walked down Mill Road, and I went into the council depot. There were no barriers in those days. You didn't have to have a CV. I found the man who became my foreman. I said, have you got a job? And he said, if you're here at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, you've got a job. If you're not, I never want to see you again. He was pretty dismissive. I suspect my hair was halfway down my shoulders. I probably wore jeans with a hole in them and a t-shirt. I discovered later that I think the last 3 people he'd employed hadn't turned up, and the one before that had started with his broom and barrow from Mill Road Depot, and they picked up the barrow half a mile away and never seen him again. So it was a job I thought I was going to be doing temporarily. And I started at 6 o'clock the next morning outside the Corn Exchange in the dark with what I then thought was an old man with a flat cap called Ernie Hart. And he was lovely.
Okay, so Ernie Hart.
So, yeah, Ernie was my introduction to Cambridge, I suppose. And my introduction to Cambridge in the dark in winter, sweeping the streets. And in a way I was out of my comfort zone. So, I got a plummy accent, and I'd been to university, and Ernie had other temporary people work with him before who'd been and gone. And he could have been really intolerant. You could have been just another middle class student who's doing this to get some money, if you like, using the job before they go off and earn loads of money somewhere else. And maybe that's what could have happened to me, I don't know. But I loved it. Ernie was wonderful. He treated me like a father. He was gentle. If he'd finished sweeping he showed me what to do. If he'd finished sweeping his side of the road first, he'd come and help me do mine. It was developing trust with someone. We'd buy tea every day. He always bought the tea for me twice a day. He was an older man like my dad, so I let him buy the tea. I was on until he came to retire, but I thought actually Ernie's got a wife and a son and he's earning the same money as me, but I just let the older person buy the tea. He'd buy the cakes on Friday, treat ourselves to a cake from Fitzbilly's. And I suppose, why I stayed at the job is Ernie is one of the reasons. It was, what is it about a job? Actually, even more so now. At the times I thought I made a mistake, but even more so now. I think now I've retired and you get sort of towards the end of your life, but actually what matters is less what you do in a job, I think, but how you do it and the people you work with. If you're working, you get paid for working 40 hours a week. How those hours are spent are really important. Your sense of well-being, if you want for any other word. I've done boring jobs. I worked in a bacon factory once, just cutting the sides of pig in half, taking the bones out. You could do it in 3 minutes, stripping the bones out and putting it through a bacon machine. And all you do is and the clock was above you, and all you do is just watch that clock, and you know roughly how many pigs you're going to get through in a day. And I can still smell when I go into a freezer cupboard. I remember going into the Danish bacon, there's a big freezer van, and just that smell takes that all back. And I remember in the tea room there was a young girl there, younger than me, and all she'd do was read romantic novels. And at the time I was dismissive. Why don't you read a newspaper? Why are you reading these? But I can see why she wanted that fantasy world where a millionaire was going to sweep her off her feet and take her away to a different life. So being bored in the job is awful. I wasn't bored sweeping the streets, strangely enough. It was variety. I was moving around. I liked working with Ernie. Ernie introduced me to the people he knew. Ernie took huge pride in Cambridge. This was his city, where he'd been born. It was his people who knew him, who walked down the streets, and it mattered that they were clean. And I had to do it too. I had to do it because it was my job, but primarily I had to do it because it mattered to Ernie, and Ernie was my mate. So I found myself thinking I wasn't going to stay in Cambridge very long, and staying longer than I'd planned. I wanted to travel. I didn't want to do what some people did, which is go around the world. The people I meet who'd spend a year travelling around the world mostly spend their time talking about diarrhea and what they had yesterday, and almost forget where they'd been to. I had spent 3 months hitching around Italy. I read a book by John Julius Norwich about the Normans in Sicily, and it intrigued me. I liked the idea that the Normans had been to Sicily, and I wanted to go to Sicily, so I hitched down to Sicily. I spent a month with no money travelling around Sicily, but I enjoyed that. I was captivated by the romance of, I suppose, this fusion of the Normans and the Arabs and the Greeks in Sicily, and I wanted to see beyond. And the council let me have 2 months leave of absence. So I went to Israel for a while to see a friend on a kibbutz, and then I went to eastern Turkey and up to the Armenian border, and then I wanted to see beyond that. And the council another year let me stay. I ended up staying on the council. I saw a program on television about these people living in Chitral who were meant to be descendants of Alexander the Great soldiers. And again, I suppose I was more, the romance of history in those days was there more, I suppose. And I was curious to see them, and I wanted to see what was beyond the Armenian border. So I remember going to travel agents and asking how I got to Chitral, and they told me to get a plane to Istanbul and get a bus. So I got a plane to Istanbul, and I got a bus through Iran. I went to Tehran and to the Afghan border, and another bus and a dolmush round Afghanistan, and I saw those amazing Buddhas. I don't know if you've seen them, those Buddhas at Bamiyan that were blown up by the Taliban.
I've seen the pictures.
I just remember walking around the base of those. And then I did get to Chitral, and I went to these Kalash Village, and I walked around and came home. But so one of the reasons I stayed with the council is that in those days it was possible to get leave of absence and a job to come back because they couldn't recruit staff, and they were happy to have someone who was reliable. And again, that's just a change in employment conditions these days. Nowadays you fight for a job on the council. I was really lucky to have, and in retrospect, I now realise when you're young you think I can have that job or I can have that job, but actually as you get older you realise that if people in post, as long as they live, they probably are in that job and you can never get it. And actually now even to get a job as a road sweeper in Cambridge is incredibly difficult, let alone anything if you want to aspire to anything higher, because there's less mobility.
Did you find, you talked about the arrogance of the students, or they seemed rather toughish, which they were still at that point. less so now, but did you find the attitude of people when you were dressed as a road sweeper and sweeping roads very different from when you were just dressed normally and wandering around as a person in Cambridge? In other words, do you find arrogance towards you?
No. I would qualify it, actually, because actually one of the things that I think about Cambridge is it's quite a tolerant place. And I was making presumptions about the students when I first came here without knowing any. And that frames my experience at Cambridge, really, until quite recently. You asked me to come into King's, and I have made part of my living showing people around the colleges, but I'd never been inside a room in a college before. And actually, I've lived most of my life in Cambridge without meeting people from the university. Most of the people I know don't work for the university, and I didn't really meet students, so I made a value judgment about them without really knowing them. In terms of how people judge you as a road sweeper, I do always remember there was a lady who used to park a bike in St Edward's Passage, which I used to sweep around at the time I did it, and she never said good morning, and I used to always say good morning to people. And when I became a tour guide, I remember going to a reception at the Guildhall. Everybody was introduced to the mayor, and this woman wasn't a tour guide, but she was there for some reason. She was a middle-class professional Cambridge woman, and she was behind me in the queue waiting to see the mayor. And she turned round to me and said, "Hello, what do you do for a living?" And I said, "I see you every day." And the lesson I learned from that is a uniform makes you invisible. I wore, as a road sweeper, I wore bright orange overalls, and I was highly visible, and yet that made me invisible, because all people see is a council worker, and they see a road sweeper, and they don't look beyond that.
That's really what I meant.
And I think uniforms, I always used to call it my invisible jacket. It was there to make me visible, to stop me getting run over, but actually it made me invisible. But there again, I remember when I trained as a tour guide, I remember the first group I met, I'd spent a year doing a course. I was very nervous. I'd done exams at the end of it. I was nervous about how to actually interact with people, and I met this group of Americans. I was very nervous because you've got this information, but shaping it into a story or for the particular group is quite difficult. And I'd been sweeping earlier in the day, and I'd taken my jacket and my tie and my white shirt to work with me. I'd changed in a horrible dirty place that we used to keep our barrows in, and gone off after, I was tired. I'd done 9 hours at work already, and I went off to do this tour. And I thought they're just going to see a road sweeper. And I couldn't believe that they were, within 3 minutes, listening to everything I said. And what they saw was somebody from Cambridge with a jacket and a tie, and they assumed I was a university professor. And it taught me the power of clothes. You see what you're looking for, don't you?
You do. What was it, perhaps you've answered it, but what was it that really kept you in Cambridge? I mean, as you say, it's flat and dull, and the buildings are a bit dreary at times. Why? I mean, it clearly wasn't that you couldn't have gone somewhere else, but
I spent 10 years thinking I was going back to Yorkshire. I spent 15 years thinking I was going to be doing another job, probably. At one point I did ask about teaching. This would be in the 70s, teacher training, and I was told that they didn't want secondary school history teachers anymore, which is what I thought I wanted to teach. So why I stayed here, I mean, a combination. One was, I think, Cambridge became home. It's what I said earlier about my grandmother coming from Yorkshire, but I thought she'd come from Hertfordshire. I suppose it's the realisation that as an adult you create your own home. It's not a place that you are in forever. I thought I was going to go back to live in Yorkshire. I was happy there, but actually after a while you realise that the people you knew there don't live there any longer either. And you know more people here in Cambridge, even though it's a place you think you're passing through. And then economic. There was a point where I'd done what had happened in Bradford happened here. I had a bedsit in Newnham that lasted about a year. I ended up having to sleep on someone's floor for 4 months, which was awful. I got offered a friend was working in around. He was building golf courses, and he offered me a room in his house. He just gave me an address and said, "Go there and let yourself in." I walked from Newnham to Eden Street, which in those days seemed a long way away. It was a big, tall house. I walked in. There was no electricity downstairs. It had been bought by the council for the redevelopment of the Kite area. It's the nearest I've been to a squat. There was electricity upstairs and hot water. And Paul's room was downstairs with a mattress on the floor. But after sleeping on someone's floor on floorboards in a sleeping bag, to sleep on a mattress was paradise. And yeah, it was being sublet from. I mean, that's a Cambridge story in itself. It was sublet from the council by a guy called Chris Curry.
The Chris.
Well, yeah, Chris Curry had been a poor engineer in Cambridge who was a mate of Clive Sinclair's, but in the period, which can't have been very long, to been subletting it, he'd gone from that to being the first Cambridge entrepreneur, I suppose. With him and Herman Hauser set up Acorn Computers, and Chris Curry had gone from living in this virtual squat himself to buying a country mansion. He bought. I mean, it's such a repetition of 19th century. What happened to 19th century? He bought a country mansion out at Croxton, and he still continued to sublet this to a collection of people. The basement was barricaded with a grand piano because Gus lived in the basement. Gus did all sorts of things with drugs, I suspect, and had a Derek Jarman garden out the back of bare earth and plants, and there was a couple of art students upstairs and some other people. And eventually I got a room upstairs in daylight with electricity. And then I moved to somewhere else. I ended up, a friend lived in St Mary's Lane. I got a room there. But I got fed up just going from year to year, losing where you lived. And I suppose I wanted my own physical home. And I had a choice, I suppose, at that point. I could have got a professional training that would give me more money. I think people have forgotten that the 70s, I think people have forgotten the unemployment in the 70s and 80s wasn't that easy. Or I could use my job. I started early, I finished early, to do another job and save some money and try and get a house that way. And I ended up road sweeping. I'd have one day off a fortnight. I'd do overtime at Saturdays and Sundays. I got an exam in the afternoons at the examination syndicates, packing exam papers. And I worked in the Eagle pub in Bennett Street 4 nights a week. I got obsessive about saving money. I had a little notebook, I've still got it somewhere, how much I'd saved each week. You don't want to spend anything. I'd cook a big bowl of food every Sunday to live on for the rest of the week, so you could get in the house. My mum last year was in hospital. She had dementia, and I was down in Surrey, and I went to this hospital on a dark night, and this guy at the next table, next bed, said, "Hello, Alan." And I didn't know who the hell this guy was. He said, "I always tell my son about you." And it turned out he was someone who'd gone out with the friend I'd shared this house with in Little St Mary's Lane. And 35 years later, I'd known him for 6 months, but his whole memory of me was me coming in the house, eating and going off from one job to another. And he said, "I always tell my son about you, and I because you work so hard." And actually all I wanted to do was not have to work. So my self-image of not wanting to have to work so hard, but his image of me was working hard, and for 2 or 3 years I did that. And it gave me enough to get a deposit with my job to buy a house. We bought a house in Mill Road. I bought a house in Mill Road in Romsey Town, which was again...
Which street?
Cockburn Street. But it was Cockburn Street when I moved in, it was Cockburn Street when I left. Which was a street of small terraces with an outside toilet. I got an improvement grant to do it up. People have forgotten the state actually played a big hand in those days. Like, yeah, you got income tax relief. You got an improvement grant from the taxpayer to do it up. It's the only way we could afford it. Nobody wanted to live near the railway line, and nobody wanted to live in Romsey Town. And it was just most of the people in the street had lived there all their lives. So now, in 2013, Cambridge doesn't seem very big, but when you're new to a place, each little area is different and you feel your way around it. Even though I'd lived in Cambridge a while, I hadn't gone over that bridge into Romsey Town, so it was new territory. And then I ended up, it took me 5 years to modernise the house. I met my wife. I nearly moved to London. She was working in a job centre in Hackney. I'd met her in Cambridge. She moved down to London. In the end, I could have gone to London, or she could have come here. I was a bit stubborn. She came here. She always blamed me for destroying her career. She ended up becoming the manager of the job centre in Cambridge. But and then we bought another house and we did that up, and suddenly you're in your 40s, and suddenly Cambridge had become home. In that process, it was never conscious, but Cambridge became home, and somehow, somewhere in that journey, I show people around these buildings now and think they're fantastic. I think we are so lucky to live in a town surrounded by this architecture and these green spaces, in a place where the local, in a way, part of the elite, if you like, are academic. I like that. And I like the fact that it's flat. I like hills, but it's actually nice as you get older not to have to go up them regularly. And I like the young people. I went to see my brother, who does live down in Surrey, the other week, and I thought, it's a lovely town, it's in Greenbelt, Surrey, it's very pretty, but actually it's almost sterile. What's missing, because there's nobody between the age of 18 and 30 there. I'd never noticed it before, but because actually it's only a place that families live, kids leave. And that's to say, there's so many towns, isn't it? I like living in a place which is buzzing with mostly very nice middle-class kids. There may be too many kebab shops and sometimes people get drunk, but it's actually a nice environment. And then the surrounding area, as I've got older, what I used to think that the fens was just boring and flat, and I trained as a tour guide for all of East Anglia, and I think in that training it made me appreciate the whole region. But I now love going from here to Ely, and the flatness is, but you've got vistas. One of the things I liked about hills, you can stand on top of a hill and have a view, but actually in East Anglia you don't need to climb to the top of the hill. You've got a view, you've got a sense of space, you've got light. And I love the Norfolk and Suffolk coasts. Again, when I was younger, I thought cliffs and Cornwall is your conventional British scenery, isn't it? The seaside is meant to be Cornwall, and coves, and actually I find coves enclosing. So I'm walking, in days, I'm walking around the East Anglian coast from Felixstowe to King's Lynn. In days, I've got as far as Southwold. But I just love those skies. And you get away from people just as well as you do in the Peak District or the Pennines. So I suppose, and I think what I'm conscious of is actually a sense of place. I don't know if you just make a place your own, but I think place is important to your sense of well-being.
So to sum it all up, how would you put it?
Well, I suppose what I'm curious about is landscape and about society, and how both have been shaped by people. They didn't just appear as they are. I wanted to teach. I never became a teacher, but maybe I found another way in. And that in a job as a road sweeper, I ended up going around primary schools talking about rubbish and recycling, but really that was just about getting kids to look at their surroundings and to appreciate them, and to realise that the rubbish didn't just disappear on its own, and wouldn't it be nice if it wasn't there in the first place. And as a tour guide, I've shown people around the buildings of Cambridge or around the landscape of East Anglia, and I've been able to do the same thing, really, to encourage them to look at it, to appreciate it, and to make them realise that what's nice what they like is only there because people who created it and people actually continue to fight to make it like that. And maybe sometimes to encourage people to think about the bigger political picture, which goes back to Bernard Crick, really, I think, where I started.
And there was recognition of this, I'm delighted to say, by my university when they gave you an Honorary M.A. Is that right?
I couldn't believe, I mean, I had a letter from the university saying, would I accept an Honorary M.A.? I didn't believe it was real, because you don't get letters these days any longer. I thought someone had faked it. But yes, it was really very flattering. I felt it was undeserved. I think loads more people deserved it more than me. For 30 years I've swept in front of the Senate House when the parents have come to see their children get their degrees. I've probably been there invisible to them. And then there I am, I had to get a gown, and my mother, she had Alzheimer's, but she came in her best clothes, and my family came, and I was in the Senate House getting a degree. I got a degree from Sheffield, but I never went to get it because I was working at the time, and I was in 20-something or other and dismissive of sort of formality. Actually, and I'm old enough now to appreciate the fact if you're going to get a degree, if you're going to have a bit of ceremony, the Senate House in Cambridge is about the best place to do it. And it was really nice, and people said nice things, and you did feel special for a day. It was in the national press. I remember one person who walked past me for years, who'd never spoken to me, must have worked for the university, and he stopped me and said, I've seen you in the Times. And then another lady pushed a bike past me, a cleaner in one of the colleges, and she'd never spoken to me for years, and she said, I've seen you in the Mirror. And then my hospital consultant said, I picked up a copy of the Metro on the Underground in London, and your picture was in it, Alan. And I think actually, I suppose that's where you learn your lesson. You end up on the floor of the Metro. But it was very nice. I had a Chinese gentleman stop me. I was sweeping down the backs, and he wanted to take my photograph, and he'd seen me in a picture in a newspaper in China. They had a picture of a Chinese road sweeper, and they'd cut my head off from another picture and top it on top of the Chinese road sweeper. So you're special for a day, and then it goes back to normal, and that's how it should be. But it really does make me think that everybody deserves a pat on the back. But that was really, I suppose, the services to Cambridge, and it was really nice. It made me feel that maybe you've done something useful with your life. I'd have liked to earn more money. It would have been nice to have more money, but now at the age of 62, we've got through. We've got a house. We're incredibly lucky to live in a place like Cambridge. It's a place which is beautiful. It's a place where you don't have to get in a car to go everywhere. I think that's a huge plus. It's not too big. It is flat. That's good.